My name is Mary Downey Coyne, and Coyne is my married name. And I'm from Wellesley, Massachusetts, and I have three ancestors of my own from Ireland and my husband's as well. I'll start with my husband's, the Coynes, C-O-Y-N-E, but I found out that actually it's K-Y-N-E in the original form. And I have just found his grandfather, and he was from Knockranny in County Galway, and he was born in 1847, so right about the time of the famine. And it is a town just north of Spill, and a lot of the people along that area, along the coast, emigrated, and a lot of them emigrated to Portland, Maine. His name was Michael Coyne, and he had married a woman named Sabina Connor. And Michael died, evidently, in 1846, just before this grandfather of my husband's was born. And so his wife, his mother, remarried a Patrick Flaherty. And evidently, in 1850, I discovered that they immigrated to the United States, and I think they went to New York. That's a story I have, but I haven't been able to document that. But eventually, Patrick Flaherty ended up in Portland, Maine. The local story is that they were looking for people to work on the railroad, and they did recruit a lot of people from New York City to come up and work. So that family went up there, and there was several children, about 5 of them. And I found the wedding of one of the daughters in Portland, Maine, and she eventually moved to Lancaster, New Hampshire, married a Matthew Smith, who was from Ireland. I don't know anything about him. The mother took the youngest children, who included my husband's grandfather, and evidently Patrick Flaherty worked on the railroad, and they were building the tracks from Portland, Maine to Montreal. And so the place along the way, the sort of halfway point, was Island Pond, Vermont. And so they settled in Island Pond, Vermont. And I discovered that they had another child with her new husband, and she was the first child baptized in the Catholic church that opened in Island Pond, Vermont that time. So it must have been a new community. I sort of lost track of that. But my husband's grandfather, he was very young at the time, but when he was 9, he was sent down to live with his sister, who was living in Lancaster, New Hampshire, so that he could go to the local schools. So he grew up there, in essence, in his sister's house, and eventually he set up a farm across the river in I can't think of the name of it, in Vermont, Maidstone, Vermont, and had a farm there. Supposedly it was, he had maple sugar farm along with the regular farm. And eventually his 2 older sons then moved to Waterville, Maine, and worked on the railroad. And they convinced him eventually to come and work on the railroad as well, which he did. And so he moved to Waterville, his wife, and he was working there less than a year. And this was the day before Christmas when he was working in the rail yard. And he got caught between 2 trains, 2 cars. And there was a description I found in the newspaper, which was rather ghastly, of how he was crushed. And they took him off to the hospital. Actually, they put him on a cart and wheeled him to the train station, and then eventually they called the doctor, and then they eventually brought him to the hospital, and of course he died within 24 hours. So that was a pretty sad Christmas, and so the family then did well. The boys, my husband's father was the youngest boy. He was only 5 or 6, and so he was raised by his mother and the older brother. And so the older brother sort of became a surrogate father. And they all lived in Waterville, Maine, and became Mainers. I'll sort of end that story there, and there's more to it. But the Irish part I've done. The other stories relate to my family. Both of my paternal grandparents were from Ireland, and my mother was from Ireland. My mother came over when she was 19 years old. She was born in Newtown, Bannow, County Wexford, which is down right on the ocean. And she found her mother died when she was 15, and so she felt there really wasn't anything there for her. And she left, and her aunt was living in New York City, and her brother, so she came and joined them, and worked as a maid, and worked in a, of course she came about the time of the Depression, so it was really pretty difficult. But the nice thing was that she did land a job working for a very wealthy family in New London, and she was a second floor maid. And the story goes that the fellow who was in charge of the house and keeping the clocks going and everything was also Irish, and he was going back to Ireland for a visit, and so he had his nephew come down and take his place for the week or so that he was gone, and that turned out to be my father. So that's how the two of them met, working in this very wealthy family in New London, Connecticut. My father's parents, both his parents, his mother was a Heffernan, and she came from County Limerick, from Ballyfruta, County Limerick, and I have a lot of information on them. They were fairly well off. They had a fair amount of land, and there was a large group of family there, brothers and sisters, and actually, and cousins as well. And it seemed like just about all the Heffernans left at one time in the 1880s and emigrated to the United States. And I found his grandparents and his parent ship manifest, and they did land in New York City, so they then took another boat, I think, to Salem, and they ended up in Salem, Massachusetts. And as I've investigated at the time, they lived down by the docks on what's called Darby Street, and it's very nice now, but at the time there were some very large tenements there, and I suspect that it was very crowded. It was probably like it is now for most immigrants, when there's a whole group of people living in one or two rooms, and so they lost the two youngest children and one of the older boys during that first couple of years living under those conditions. I guess they just didn't thrive. That was pretty much what the death certificates said. But eventually they did all right and owned a house, and I think the grandmother was a pretty smart cookie, because she ended up buying another house, and so she had a house that she rented out. They had a second house behind the one they lived in, and they took in boarders and rented that out, and I think they rented out rooms in the house. So she did very well. She, I think, accumulated a good bit of money. I don't think the husband was too good at much of anything. So then the other family, my father's father, came from County Meath, and from right near King's Court, which is a rather large city. And they were in a small town called Rathlogan, and I had no idea where he came from at all. I mean, I finally figured it out by various means. And his mother is, his grandmother actually, is in the Griffiths valuation, and she's obviously a widow living in a very small cottage. So I found the death of the father, and he died in 1847. So just as the time of the famine, she was left with three young boys that were probably from the ages of 2 to 5, and so she had to bring them up. And so she was in a very small little cottage, I don't know, with just a garden, so I don't know how she existed, but there was probably family around. But eventually her sons did all right, and they bought other land in the same area and farmed. And there were the two of the sons emigrated to the United States, and one of the sons stayed behind. And so we knew that there was, my grandfather and father, and this other brother that was in Marblehead, Massachusetts. And we knew they existed. And when I finally did the research and got back, there was another brother that actually had stayed in Ireland, which we knew nothing about. And so we finally found his descendants. Unfortunately, his two sons didn't have any children, and I, by various means, found this woman, local woman, who unearthed the three daughters, because their names were different. And so they didn't know that there were two brothers in the United States. They had no idea. And so we arranged to go back and meet them. And so we met all those cousins. We saw the houses where the people lived, and that was a really wonderful event when we got to see them. So that's sort of my 4 stories.